This presentation is about a novel approach to speech and language for a variety of disorders, as well as implications to those who are working in an office or for a brand to promote that brand or to create better products. I'll begin with the exercise that we use, and then I'll go into the science behind it. This is only one exercise, but unlike other speech-language pathologists, what I'm doing is a lot of visual activity, issues with the production of language or the perception of language, which is driven by the eyes, and particularly this region called the precuneus. So just to play along with me, just focus your eyes on the center large red circle. And if both eyes are on there, and this is easier to do when it's not on a screen, we usually do it on paper. Then you're just resting your mind, and you move to the second image, and you move your eye there. Then to the third image, you move your eye there. I do it a little slower when I'm actually with somebody. But then you move to all the images, and then you're in the center. I'm going to try to explain the science behind this. It's going to have to go a little quick, otherwise it'll get really boring and techy. But essentially what I talk a lot about in my book is this idea of hemispheric concordance. In other words, the two hemispheres are very different. And we know this because when the corpus callosum, that's the channel between the two, is cut, and you ask individuals what occupation they would prefer, and you'll get different answers from them. So these different hemispheres are choosing different values. The visual field, whatever on your left, is being fed from both eyes into your right hemisphere, and whatever is on your right is fed into your left. And there is obviously cooperation in the back of the brain, the visual cortex, to create one image, but each hemisphere, as I said, it has different values, limits, goals, and abilities. And as we probably know, the language is mainly happening in the left brain, and so that is going to influence how you describe and how you respond to what you're seeing with language. So now we're going to talk about the precuneus. It's not very well known. You'll notice, however, that it's very close to the visual cortex. So it's a mysterious region. We know it's involved in episodic memory retrieval and self-processing operations, namely the idea of taking a first-person perspective and an agency who's doing things. So obviously you can see how that's important in grammar, as well as in a corporate setting, who is actually going to take responsibility for actions. The precuneus containing your self-image, your memory, the idea of what other people are capable of and how that reflects upon you, and who is responsible for things. Now, if you're presented with a personality trait, they did an experiment on this, and you're asked to categorize them as either accurate or inaccurate, that is when the precuneus is activated. So we can, even though this region is not very well understood, we know we can activate it by simply talking about adjectives that describe you and not describe you, in your view. So the eyes are taking in the image, both eyes are taking it in, sending it to the angular gyrus, if it's a word. Not an image, but we can use both in the work that we do. But if it's a word, the angular gyrus, which is a region just in front of the precuneus, it makes meaning out of the words, and then the precuneus looks at that and searches the memories to see if that's an accurate description of who you are. Now all that takes a lot of effort. It consumes more than 30%, or about 35%, more than any other region in the brain. So now the precuneus is posterior in the back, but the prefrontal cortex is in the front. They're strongly connected. And the prefrontal cortex is where your planning, your personality expression, your decision making, and moderating social behavior is happening. And so the precuneus is influencing what those things are. But the precuneus also has a lot of connections to the ocular motor. In other words, what are you looking at? And the raised eyelid. And we know that when you're surprised, your eyelids go up, right? Your eyebrows go up too. There's a recognition of that in a motor action. And also it could be perhaps evolved from the idea of you're trying to take in more objects or figure out what is the object to hunt or what is the object to avoid. So that idea of where your eye is going, again, extremely important in terms of your emotional state and how you're relating to any learning of information, whether it's language or receiving or expressing. Again, talk about this proximity of the precuneus to the visual cortex, and as I said, also to where the planning is happening in the front of the brain. Is that it's the silent conductor of who we think we are. And if you know spiral dynamics, this is beige. This is where we check on our safety, our feeling of confidence. Are we willing to take on risks? That is all happening based on who we think we are. So the language that we choose, the language that we hear, how we interpret what we hear, is all operating from how safe we are feeling. The second stage in Spiral Dynamics is purple. That's where the stories were, the tribes were telling stories. But in this stage, we're talking about how we relate language to our self-image. So in other words, as I said in the experiment, the words that you're choosing. And again, these are obviously operating when the precuneus figures out who you are and, in terms of planning, what you should do. Now, if there's a traumatic brain injury, a stroke, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, or learning disability, and I'll talk about people who don't have any kind of disability or disorder in a moment, but if we have those, could we nourish this region and thus empower language? This is red in Spiral Dynamics. This is the age of the empires. Where is the power going to go? All roads lead to Rome, right? So how are we going to go beyond the stories, how we see ourselves in a story, in an image, in a word, to have the precuneus say, well, let's go in a feeling of safety, of appropriate risk-taking, of not needing the story to define who we are, to go beyond those limitations. Now, in blue, in Spiral Dynamics, this is right versus wrong, right? That's when laws came up and religions were formed. But to counteract this, some of the work that I've done with students is the Socratic dialogue, and I can do this with corporations as well. And we're just basically exploring information. We're not teaching. We're just trying to figure out where is the person coming from. And so we choose content that is relevant to the client and his or her status, whether it's a student in a school or the status in a corporation. That's the kind of content we're talking about, and the brain begins to process language, and the precuneus begins to map that language to who you think you are, but then the language and the questions are aiming to move us beyond that limited framework. So first of all, the brain is committing more resources to the task, but we're doing this not out of a desire to get approval or raise your status or to avoid weakness or isolation or rejection, which is all stuff that's operating at the blue level in Spiral Dynamics. We're doing this instead to explore what are your preconceived notions about yourself based on the questions that I'm asking. In other words, the questions I'm asking are inspiring you to look beyond your limitations. Now, there's something called the emotional anti-saccade task, and basically it's just that people direct their eye towards what they're interested in rather than what they're not interested in. If it's boring or neutral, then you're not going to look at it. And this makes sense in the wild because we don't want to risk looking away from the tiger that's running at us, right? So then we move on to stage 5 in Spiral Dynamics. And this is stage 5. If you're familiar, it's the science, the rational perspective. It's trying to counteract the judgmental, rule-based, rejection, approval mode of blue, but it's just transporting it onto esteem in terms of scientific theories or business success. So it doesn't really change that same underlying fear of rejection and isolation and irrelevance and confusion, still operating just using a different, more yang-based, a more individual or stereotypically masculine-based approach, as opposed to the blue, which is more about building community and conforming to the rules, right? And so we see an organization can transform itself when it moves beyond and uses language that moves beyond and asks questions that move beyond the right-wrong paradigm and begins to move the consciousness of the organization to another level, right? And the language begins to change, and that's how we see that. So the emotional anti-saccade task is used a lot with diagnosing disorders, but we're just looking at the idea of that emotion drives attention, and you direct your eye movements towards something that's interesting. So the idea is how we use this with patients and also with corporations is we present photographs and words, but we ask people to look in the opposite direction if we're looking to see if there's a disorder in terms of mood or addiction or social anxiety. But in the case of what we're doing is we're looking at it in terms of we have present 2 words or 3 objects in a triangle or words, and we try to read what the person's language is in relationship to those words, and then ask questions to have them modify their view. But again, because we did the red dot circle, now when we do it, we're both bringing both hemispheres and a concordance to allow both hemispheres to express what they're feeling about the particular word or the image. And it could be the brand of your company, or it could be the picture of your teacher or your parent. And we move it from the left field to the right field so that we're, again, stimulating the different hemispheres to weigh in. But what we're looking for is what is the person's interest. Are they looking for safety, power, freedom, belonging, acceptance, and respect? those are the stories that are limiting them, because they aren't going to be able to be happy unless they achieve those things. And so their work is going to be stressful to them, whether they have a disorder or not, because they're trying to achieve these things which are forever elusive. So then we move to stage 6, and the idea is to transcend the need for those, the safety, power, freedom, belonging, acceptance, and respect. And so what we see is that there's a learning of language or use of language out of a fear of isolation, weakness, confusion, and rejection. In other words, you're trying to get the SPF BAR, but your language is revealing that you're just perpetuating the same quest, because you're returning back to this fear. So the fear is always there, even if you have a momentary promotion or get a good grade on a test, it comes back again. So again, to work with these clients, whether it's in a disorder framework, or whether it's in a corporation, we're going to present photographs and words and ask the participant to look at each one in a circle. We move from one to another, just like the red dot did. But we're looking about how you feel about the word or the image. And if you don't know the word, in the case of a disorder, or in the case of, maybe some word that's part of the mission statement, right, of a corporation, then we want to talk about how do you feel when the meaning is revealed. In other words, in the case of a corporate setting, when the actual party line, so to speak, is revealed about the word, and then you may have conflicting ideas about what the word is, because I'm a speech language pathologist, that is confidential, and so I'm not going to reveal that to the employer, and then the person feels safe to reveal that it is. Now, if you go in as a therapist, like a psychologist or therapist or a psychiatrist, into an office setting, and you're dealing with people who have Asperger's, or just having the clash of cultures, perhaps after a merger, the psychologist is operating under the realm if there's something wrong, whereas a speech language pathologist is simply trying to begin to explore what are the associations with the words, and can we shift those associations, and that's it. It's just about language, so it's more neutral. So the idea is that we use these techniques, these images in a star-shaped circle, or the words, not just to learn the language or learn the party line in a corporate setting, and not just for people in disorders, but the idea is to see and vocalize the emotions and relevance of the word to the person's life. Now, what's happening, if you want to go deeper into the science of this, basically these red dots that we move around the circle, or the images we move around the circle, you're having these saccades. These are very fast movements. There are voluntary and involuntary movements that happen, and they're below the conscious level. And there's a center region that's called the foveal high acuity. If you focus on the dot or focus on the word, and still your mind, and both hemispheres are getting that higher level of acuity, and then beginning to access again those 6 stages, not the 7 stage in Spiral Dynamics, which is transcending that, but those 6 stages to figure out, what am I trying to prove here? What are my fears and desires associated with these words and images? And so that is obviously a very useful thing in individuals who are attempting to improve their corporate structure, or in terms of trying to learn language in school, or any kind of framework like that. So again, just to link it all together, I know this is a lot of information and presented very quickly, but so the precuneus, the eye, and language. So the precuneus links the tracking of moving targets and shifting attention between object features. And some say that language developed from our ability to distinguish the visual and tactile surface features. In other words, like hunting and gathering, like what kind of berry is this, what kind of nut is this, what's that motion, is that an animal I hunt or not? That is all a precursor to language. And we know this because the movement back then, when we were, even before we were humans, right? We have that history in our DNA and our neurology. But the movement from the hunger to the eye gaze, what am I looking at? What can I eat? To the language, apple or tiger, or avoid the tiger, I don't want to be eaten. And then to being fed or not being eaten, right? So the idea is that the eye gaze is central to our relationship with language, and whether it's in a disorder context or whether it's in a corporate context, the same is operant. Just to sort of back this up with some studies, the precuneus has been linked to auditory sentence recognition, and there are many studies that say that auditory sentence recognition is more important, and it's a precursor to literacy. So that's in terms of the framework of dealing with disorders. But in a corporate setting, the auditory sentence recognition is when you're getting orders from your superior, or when you're getting feedback from your client or your customer, right? It's how are you feeling about yourself in relationship to those words that you're taking in, right? And that's from PET scans And that was done a long time ago in the 90s, but you can see this stuff is still not being used in the corporate setting or in speech and language disorders. It's also, the precunious is also very important in terms of retrieval of word pairs. Again, that's more for disorders, but it can also be when there's an association between two different words. And then we can use, I work with corporations to choose words that are perhaps opposite or that's challenged our faith in the mission statement of the corporation, or in the complaints that customers may have about products, or the challenge we have to sales, or any of those kind of things. I only do that in ethical frameworks. I'm not going to do that in an unethical way, but the idea is that we're trying to see what the associations are. The precunious is also involved in perspective taking. When you're telling a story, first person versus third person. In the realm of disorders, this is really important because it turns out that narrative assessment, story assessment, being able to tell me back a story based on pictures from a story you've been told, is the best predictor, better than any standardized test with disorders. And in terms of when you're dealing with customers, or when you're dealing with a brand, or when you're dealing with employers or employees, managers, and those who are managed, again, what is the story that we're telling ourselves? The precunious is central to that. Almost done here. The emotional state attribution, the judgment on our and someone else's emotions versus a neutral judgment. So how do we relate to our teacher? How do we relate to our boss? How do we relate to ourselves? All driven by the language that we choose and how we interpret the language that we're hearing. Now, it's not entirely clear how to engage this region. These are just my theories. And one of the reasons why I'm pitching this to corporations is because I want to study this more deeply. And so initially I'll just be offering it to corporations in the context of a study. But really, eventually the money from consulting can fund this kind of research, because you really need a PET scanner, MRI machine to really figure out what's happening during all these things. But really the proof is in the results. So one of the other simple tasks I use, and I'll give it to you free even if you don't either hire me or bring me in to do my research, is you look at your left hand, you extend your left index finger and right index finger about shoulder length apart, and then you move them. I'm turning my mouth away from the microphone, so excuse me. So you move them slowly towards, and you're watching that, you're tracking this movement. Remember, the precunious is tracking the movement. You're trying to get these index fingers to point, so they're both pointing at each other. And really what you're doing is you're bringing a synergy in between your two hemispheres. And so I'm going to go silent, but I'm basically going to bring them both together in silence. And so what you're doing in that is you're bringing in a chord between the two hemispheres, which I said have different values, and they're interpreting language differently. The left hemisphere is where the language is processed in most people, so you're already creating an imbalance of power dynamics, and so each hemisphere, I believe, is trying to trump the other. And so what we need to do, I believe, is these kind of precunious exercises, and I have a bunch of others that I can share, in order to find the right language to get along with people better, and also to excel in an academic setting. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, because I know there's a lot of information, feel free to reach out and contact me. Thanks.